Hello, everybody. It's great to be back. Good evening. Happy New Year's. And today we have a very special webinar. We're going to be talking about security issues of Israel, especially in the north in the Syrian border. And perhaps we'll be able to even widen that to regional areas. Very shortly, a very good friend of mine, Captain Ilan Shulman, will be joining us. He is an expert on all things strategic in Israel, especially in the north and in Syria. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Golan Heights, first of all, so that we can just make sure everybody's online with everything. And without further ado, let's do that. So I'm going to switch to our Israeli map. And hopefully everybody will be able to see this. I'm going to use the white marker over here. All of this area is Israel from north to south, about 400 miles, 648 kilometers as the crow flies. And what we're going to be talking about mostly right now is this little area over here that I'm painting. This is what we call the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights was not a part of Israel originally, and in 1949, it was in fact a part of Syria. That is true until 1967 when Israel conquers the Golan Heights region. Now, aside from the Golan Heights, there's an area approximately over here going around like this through Jerusalem, at least half of Jerusalem, which is somewhere around this area. And this is what we call the West Bank. It is to the west of the Jordan River. So it is the west bank of the Jordan River. Here is the Jordan River, a line towards the Dead Sea. And aside from this area, we also had this part that I'm marking now. And this is what we call the Gaza Strip. Now, the Gaza Strip was militarily controlled by Egypt. They never annexed it. They didn't give citizenship to the people living over in this area. And the West Bank was never annexed by Jordan. They had military control over this area and never gave citizenship to the people living in this area. And what happens is that in 1967, Israel takes over this area of the West Bank and takes over the area of the Gaza Strip. Notice that I didn't use the word conquer for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this is because they were militarily controlled and they were never a part of Jordan and was never a part of Egypt either. So all that happened in 1967 in this area of the West Bank and in this area of the Gaza Strip is a change of military control. Instead of Jordanian military control in the West Bank, we now have Israeli military control. And instead of Egyptian military control in the Gaza Strip, we have Israeli military control. But, and again, I'm going to say this, Syria controlled. This was a part of Syria. The Golan Heights was Syrian territory with Syrian citizens living there. And therefore, when Israel takes over that area, we absolutely conquer that region that is called the Golan Heights. So let's zoom in a little bit more to see this area. And as before, mark the border. Now, Syria doesn't really recognize Israel as a sovereign state, and borders are between states. So in reality, if I need to be more accurate, the line over here, this white line to the far right top corner of the drawing of the picture, this is not a border, but more of a ceasefire line. And today we have just over 75,000 people living there, citizens of the state. Amongst them are former Syrian citizens who refused to leave in 1967. The majority of them live up here somewhere in a few towns that are Druze towns. In a different webinar, we'll talk about the Druze religion as well. And they were offered citizenship as well. Not all of them decided to take up Israel's offer. Some of them are today still residents as opposed to citizens, but they were formerly Syrian citizens. We are going to hand it off to Captain Ilan. We're going to start with a video, and after that, we're going to have some live questions and answers session. We're not going to have too much time. Hopefully, we'll be able to at least hit on a few interesting points. Remember, Israel just had 4 peace treaties with Arab countries in the region. You are more than welcome to ask him about that as well. And of course, about Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Sunni Shiites, and all of the rest of that. Enjoy the video, and we'll get back to you soon.
First of all, nice to meet you all. My name is Ilan Shulman. We started from a kibbutz by the Syrian border, and now we got practically to the backyard of the kibbutz. And we, as you can see partly, we have kind of a special backyard. Even for Israelis, be surprised. Means from the back gate of the kibbutz, we're getting to the farming land. But here, once we get gradually closer to the border, we're starting to see also military use. Once we crossed the farming land, we passed by the reservoir of the kibbutz, and we saw guys that came here to do kite surfing, which is practically 2 miles from the Syrian border. And here we see the cattle of the kibbutz. We have here cattle for beef, and we can see one of the turbine of supposed to be the biggest wind farm in Israel. And this is now something that in construction they're building it, and in a matter of few months we're going to start to see those turbines turning. This is a paved road that has a yellow line in the center. This is something that usually in Israel you don't see. The yellow line is in the side, and in the center we see usually white line. But once we see it as here in the opposite way, means this is a military road. Above us there's a military position with the special forces of the paratroopers occupying it. And here below us we can see the farming land of the kibbutz. And let's take the camera here to the left, and you can see that we're passing by minefields. But this is pretty common to see on the Golan Heights. We do have minefields here, part of the landmines planted by the Syrians pre-67, before the 6-Day War. And most of the landmines that we see here in this area of the Golan are mines that are planted by Israel, especially after the Yom Kippur War of 1973. We're also going to see here different parts of the defense line, many of them upgraded or completely changed since that war of 1973. I would say that generally that countries and armies tend to prepare themselves for the next war by the lessons of the last one. Once the last war we had here on the Golan with Syria was the Yom Kippur War of 1973, a very traumatic war. Part of it because of the surprise, part of it because of being unprepared, and I would say mostly because of the casualties. 2,656 Israeli soldiers got killed. And here in the Golan, the Syrians breached the border using 1,400 tanks, means 5 divisions. Once against them stood 177 Israeli tanks. Those are the official numbers, but at the beginning of the war, the situation was that we had only 30 tanks along the border, which is practically barely free companies. And so we're talking about those 30 tanks that stood against 280 Syrian tanks. At the end of the 27 hours, the first, I would say, 24 hours of the war, the situation was that Israel had here a little bit more than 170 tanks standing against practically 1,400 Syrians. So those were the numbers of the Yom Kippur War. Therefore, we had so many casualties. 500 Israeli soldiers got killed only in the Golan, only on the Syrian front, only in the first 24 hours of the war. It included one of the brigade commanders, deputy, 2 battalion commanders. All the company commanders got killed, all on the first day of the Yom Kippur War. That was the trauma that reflects by the defense line that designed as a result of that war. We have here tanks positions as this one, it's called ramp. We have here anti-tanks, ditches, We have anti-tanks, minefields. It's mostly about tanks. The thing is that the threats changed. Syria changed. Some will say there's no Syria anymore. And now with the camera we look into Syria, the water reservoir there in the distance, that's Syria, and we're getting closer. In the same time, the orchards that we see here below us, and we have few tractors that now preparing the land, destoning for new orchards. These are still the lands of the kibbutz. So that's the fragile balance of civilian use and the military needs. I don't expect for an attack as we had in 1973 coming from Syria. I think that today Israel finds itself facing a very different situation than the one we used to during the War of Independence of 48, or during the Sinai War of 56, Six-Day War of 67, Yom Kippur War of 73, First Lebanon War of 82. Those were wars against armies. And today we're facing NGOs, non-governmental organizations, not those ones that are taking care of human rights, but I can't call Hezbollah, and this is the biggest militia that Israel facing along the Lebanese and the Syrian border, unfortunately, is not exactly an army. They don't have tanks because they don't want to have tanks. They don't have aircrafts, since for them there's no need of having aircrafts. Instead, they want to have anti-tanks weapons, anti-tanks missiles. They want to have anti-aircrafts missiles batteries. This is something that they work very hard in order to get. The problem with those kind of organizations, that they can switch from a mode of routine to a mode of a war in half a minute. We can't. It will take the IDF between 24 to 36 hours to bring forces to the border. And this is something that Israel have to prepare for. And therefore, since 2014, the whole conception of defense changed along the border with Syria. We'll get there and see the new fence built with motion sensors, video cameras, intelligent drones, bomber drones, unmanned vehicles. All the units changed. Means to see here special forces of the paratroopers. Before the civil war in Syria started in March 2011, you couldn't. We had mostly reservists. We have here tanks brigades, we have artillery, we have many intelligence units. So the situation changed. So hello again, and here welcome to Syria. Practically we're by the border with Syria. We enter to a closed military area, something that can be coordinated also with groups. There's a post there, that red-white tower that have two cameras on the top, so those cameras now filming us. The Israeli army not very used to see Israelis civilians coming here to those areas, and especially now during the COVID. So we coordinate a little bit less, and so we might see the Israeli patrol coming to say hi. Regarding to the things that we see here, so we can see the border fence. Practically we don't have a border with Syria, we have a ceasefire line. Border, it's a boundary between two countries that recognize each other. Syria never recognized the existence of Israel, and therefore we never had a border. That new border fence is the one that has the motion sensors and the video cameras. Over the fence you can see a city in Syria that called Medinat al-Ba'as, the city of revival or reborn. So that's the reborn of the old Kurnetra, which is a ghost town a little bit further south, close to us also. A town that was conquered by Israel during the Six-Day War and was given back by Israel during the agreements of disengagement in May 74. Since then it left as a ghost town, and here we have the new one built in 76. Today the city is completely abandoned. You won't see civilians here. You're going to see military forces, and you're going to see other forces that not necessarily connect to the Syrian army. So I want to start here from the end a little bit, from the last few events during the past few months. And I would say, and in order to understand how things work today along the Syrian border, the border that consider, or ceasefire line, that considers the quietest we had in Israel, almost nothing happened here. Why nothing happened? Because of the fact that you could sit in the Mujahideen square in the central part of Damascus, talking about the extinction of Israel, and it could make you to be very popular among your guys. But if you actually tried here to commit any kind of an attack crossing the Israeli border, you would find yourself in one of the 7-star hotels of the Syrian army without seeing a daylight for the rest of your life. So Syria made a strategic decision. They will keep this border quiet and in the same time support Hezbollah, Hamas for fighting Israel. Therefore, almost nothing happened here till the civil war in Syria began. And here let's get to this year, 2020. On the 8th of July, we had the Iranian chief of staff coming to Syria in order to have a meeting with the Syrian defense minister. The defense minister, Ali Abdallah Ayub, got a promise from the Iranian that Iran will provide Syria anti-aircraft systems and different surface air missiles. This is something that Israel cannot live with. And that was the 8th of July this year. On the 20th of July, maybe with a connection, maybe not, there was an Israeli attack, according to foreign sources, by Damascus. There was a convoy over there with trucks loaded with different parts of missiles and weapons that destroyed by supposedly the Israeli planes, the Israeli aircrafts. There were few casualties over there from the Iranian Jerusalem battalion, the Al-Quds battalion, that is in charge on exporting the revolution that took place in Iran in 1979. And one of the casualties was a commander of Hezbollah. We heard a threat coming from Hezbollah that every casualty that we will have in Syria, expect for a revenge coming not only from Syria but also from Lebanon. And this is an attempt to change the rules as we knew them till the past few months, which means there's kind of a mutual deterrence between Israel and Hezbollah along the Lebanese border. But here Hezbollah come in and say, I'm not only a Lebanese organization, I'm an organization part of the axis of evil, the axis of the Shiites, or the axis of resistance, Mahwar al-Mukamma in Arabic, which means I'm part of that bridge, the land bridge that Iran trying to build from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, crossing Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. That was on the 20th of July. On the 27th, a week after, an attack of 2 terrorists from the special forces of Hezbollah to cross by the Lebanese border with a sniper that's supposed to kill Israeli soldiers in one of the positions we have a little bit further north on Mount Hermon. The decision was then of the Israeli forces was to scare them away. There were no casualties on both sides, and that's the way it ended. Hezbollah came and said, expect for more. August 3rd, we had an attempt here in the Golan of, again, 4 guys trying to put a booby trap along the border. In this case, Israel decided to deal with the situation in a different way and killed those 4. To say that since then the situation changed and Hezbollah got what they wanted, or Israel created deterrence again, I can't. because since then the Israeli army is on a high alert, and we're talking here about several months. This is a very long time. During those months, you barely could see the Israeli patrol along the border. We mostly monitor the border by technology systems, and from time to time, when we got the intelligence that they're planning to attack, Israel managed to stop it, and we heard about mysterious explosions taking place here on the other side of the border by different positions of the Syrian army usually. And here we're getting to 2 nights ago, when there was another attack to put few booby traps along the border. And again, there was an airstrike right after. Once the attack failed, someone attacked there in Syria, 8 targets. Part of them were strategic Iranian targets in Syria. So what's going on here? Means I found myself talking about the Syrian ceasefire line in a very similar way that we used to talk about the Lebanese, the most active border we have around Israel. What happened here? So first of all, I would say that it has a direct connection to the Arab Spring, which we all understand that it's not a spring. It's an Arab thing, but it's just not a spring. And we saw here most of the Arab countries, first of all, finding themselves in a situation that the leaders didn't manage to provide their people the basic needs of bread, work, and hope. And most of the people there struggle. They struggle on a daily basis on providing their kids the basic needs, to put bread on the table. And I talked with one of them, and he said, when I realized that it's not only me, but my son and my grandson and my grand-grandson will live in the same reality, that's when I lost my hope, and that's when I decided to get out of the street and for pressuring for change. And this is something that you couldn't see in a country like Syria. When the Arab Spring got into Syria, that was March 2011, a kid called Hamza al-Hatib, 13 years old, started to spray graffiti on the walls of a city further south that's called Dar'a, writing in Arabic, Yalla irhal ya Bashar, get out of here, President. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. The child disappeared a few days after. That body returned to the parents in the worst condition you can imagine. And seems like that day, the 18th of March 2011, that was the straw that broke the camel back. People started to get out to the street for protesting. It wasn't very violent in the beginning, but gradually Assad, the president of Syria, made a decision of sending his army with very clear orders. Wherever you see in the street protesting, shoot for killing. Who's the army of Syria? The countries in the Middle East usually are not very homogenic. Not in the ethnic way or in the religious way, and definitely not in the tribal way. We see now Libya having a bloody war. There are 700 different tribes in Libya. The culture of the tribe is that if you're part of my tribe, that's the Elmina, you're one of ours. I will do everything I can in order to protect you. But if you're part of a different tribe, you are the Mishminna, which means you're not one of ours. And you're barely going to see marriage of one tribe with the other. That's the situation in Syria. Besides that, we have also the Sunni-Shia war, a religious war between two fractions of the Islam. Sunnis, 85% of the Islam. The Shiites, a little bit less than 15% of the Islam. And they fight from the 7th century. Besides that, we see ethnic wars here. Take Iran, it's a Persian country. On the other hand, we see countries like Syria, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia and others. Those are Arab countries. We see Turkey. This is a Turkish country. They're not Arabs. Arabs and non-Arabs, it's like water and oil. It won't work together. So that's the situation that we see here also along the border. When Assad ordered his army to shoot the protesters, he's an Alawite. That's a fraction of the Shia. And most of his army built by Sunnis, which means that that's not one of ours. And when the Sunnis ordered to kill other Muslim Sunnis like them, they came and said, no way. Many of them defected and formed the Free Syrian Army. That was the first militia of rebels. The West supported them in the beginning, include US. The Arab countries supported them. And Israel fought it. It's a matter of a few months, and they will take over. We'll see a revolution in Syria. It wasn't the situation. Gradually we started to see different militias conquering areas here by the border, and we find ourselves facing 54 different militias of Muslim Sunnis, part of them radicals, most of them not. But in the rest of Syria, in the beginning, they had a success till Assad made a decision to bring his Shiite friends to fight in Syria and Russia. And from that point, things started to change. When Iran, a Persian Shiite country, got the opportunity to export the revolution into Syria, to spread their Shia, to get with forces into Syria, they managed to bring them with the narrative of the Sunni-Shia war. We're protecting the Shiites from the Sunni, from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda, from the radical Sunni. They managed to bring Shiites from Afghanistan, Shiites that speak Pashto. They brought Shiites from Pakistan that speak Urdu. They brought Shiites from Iraq. Militias, as they say, Ba'al al-Haq, Li Wazul al-Fakir, Li Wafad al-Abbas, Li Imam al-Hussein, Hezbollah al-Bayt, Hezbollah al-Tab, Hezbollah Harakat al-Nujaba, and many more. So once Israel saw Iran training so many forces there in Syria, what could we think? Means all those forces brought there into Syria for what? For fighting few rebels? It was pretty clear that Iran building a war machine that will be used against Israel. From my perspective, it looks that Iran want eventually to become an empire. They want to get back to the pages of the history when Iran controlled almost half of the world for more than 400 years, being part of the Persian Empire. That's where they're heading. That's the way they talk. And they give the borders, they talk about the borders, the Central Asia, and the area of Morocco, India, as part of the Persian Empire. What gives them the confidence of building that empire is the nuclear capability. Iran trying to achieve it. Iran want to become a nuclear state, or a latency nuclear state. They also saw what happened to countries that have nuclear capability in contrast to countries that don't. Take, for example, North Korea on one side, and on the other, Libya. That Gaddafi there almost had nuclear weapon till 2004. So Iran trying to understand who's the enemy of Iran that can stop them. Maybe those are the Saudis, but we saw the attack on the refineries and the oil fields in Saudi Arabia on September last year. There was no much of response coming. We also saw the attack on US, an American drone, on June last year. A drone was intercepted and there was no much of response came from that side also. So for the Iranians, the only one that keep the military credibility, the only one that respond to every attack or provocation of Iran is Israel. And they also remember the history when Israel in the 80s destroyed the nuclear reactors of Iraq, and in 2007, September, destroy the nuclear center in Syria, built by the North Koreans. They understand the same can happen to 9 reactors in Iran. And therefore Iran come in and say, we're going to create here the Korean principle. Means, who's the country that object the most for attacking North Korea? South Korea. Because they know that on the day after, doesn't matter what, Seoul won't be existent. The capital that locate less than 40 miles from the North Korea border. Iran trying to do the same thing to us. if someone will attack Iran, can be the Saudis, can be the Americans, can be the Israelis, we will destroy Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Not by launching the missile from Tehran to Tel Aviv, but from Damascus, from Beirut, from Gaza, and maybe from other places as Iran and Yemen at the same time. If we experienced during the Second Lebanon War of 2006, 5,000 missiles landing in Israel in a war of 33 days, here we should expect for 5,000 missiles a day. Today, Hezbollah has at least 150,000 missiles and rockets. The plan is to arm the different militias that Iran has in Syria with the same weapons. Long-range missiles, accurate ones. And this is another change of the equation if Iran will provide those guys nuclear weapons. And this is one of the things that Israel worked very hard in order to stop. And the last dimension that Iran want to create a threat on Israel from is here, the Syrian border. And therefore, when the Syrian army managed to recapture most of this land on June, July 2018, we started to see from August the Syrian army reoccupying their positions. Very fast, the Israeli intelligence understood that not everything that looks like a duck, fly like a duck, and quack like a duck is a duck. We realized that among those that wear uniforms of the Syrian army, we have guys of Hezbollah. Just a few days ago, the Israeli army filled, and this is something that was published, we could see a commander of Hezbollah, Haj Hashem, his real name is Munir Ali Naim Shaitu from Lebanon, standing very close to here with the commander of Division 1 of the Syrian army. So we have here two main units of Hezbollah, one of them called the Golan Heights, being more in charge on, I will call it terrorist attacks, putting booby traps as we had 2 nights ago, snipers, mostly trying to kill Israeli officers patrolling along the fence, attacking positions of the army, communities, etc. They're using mostly those that need salaries. They can use Druze, they can use Sunnis, locals here that can blend and will do a lot for a salary of $25 a month. Parallel to that unit, there's another unit that's called the Southern Front. And the Southern Front is a unit that's supposed to build the infrastructures for the Shiite militias, includes Hezbollah, for the day of order. The order will come not from Syria and not from Lebanon, but from Tehran, from Iran. This is another thing that Israel cannot allow. We find ourselves here in, I will call it a war between wars. We're trying to destroy part of those infrastructures that those guys build. We're trying to destroy different factories of weapons, different missiles, batteries. How Israel deal with the situation? So I would say that here we have a strategy. And the strategy called war between wars. The idea of Israel is to prevent from our enemies to have better capabilities that will bring themselves to a better position in the next conflict. And by doing that, hope to postpone that conflict. Those are the different attacks that you see in Syria. Sometimes there are mysterious explosions even in Iran. You always have to remember that the challenge here built by 3 different layers. There's the close layer, which are the different groups that we have here along the border with the different capabilities they're trying to get. The second layer is the layer of the long-range missiles threatening Israel. And the third layer is the nuclear. All those layers connect one to the other. Means the idea is that for Iran, in order to have the nuclear weapon, they need to spread missiles among the different activists and the different groups that they operate in the Middle East. And in order to have those missiles and create another threat on Israel, so Israel will know that when you attack a missile battery by Damascus, we might attack you here along the border. So they're arming different groups here along the border, turning civilians to be terrorists. And this is the situation that Israel have to deal with. I would say that part of it's dealing with that in the military aspect. Part of it's in many others. For example, the sanctions on Iran. A state budget of $104 billion a year reduced to less than 40 billion. The idea is eventually bring Iran to negotiate in order to achieve an agreement that will prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear state. That's what I consider as a good agreement. Once Iran won't be a nuclear state, I think that Israel will have a better way to defend itself, and most of the countries in the Middle East will. On the other hand, every crisis sometimes can turn to an opportunity, and seems like that the fact that we have a common enemy here brought us to get much closer than ever to countries that wanted to destroy us a few years ago. And today we have normalization agreements with the Emirates, with other countries. We're starting to see countries in Africa getting closer to the Sunni Arab world. This is something that I think that we'll see the benefits in the future, not only benefits of security, but also economic, technology. And we see here tour guides in Israel that's starting to guide tours in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And that's something that's quite amazing. I think that that's the way to show Iran that most of the countries in the Middle East want to live their life peacefully, once Iran trying to achieve something very different, and will find itself being completely isolated. Thank you for spending me the last few minutes coming here, crossing part of the Israeli defense line, coming here to the border of Syria, and I hope that you understood part of the things from our perspective as Israelis.
Can you guys hear me now? Yes, great. Okay, I am allowing anyone to unmute. We are joined now by Ilan Shulman, Captain Ilan Shulman. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can.
Wonderful. So please fire away, people.
How does the normalization of relations with some of the Arab nations around you, how does that, what's happening with what President Trump has done, how has that affected this whole conversation? Is it helping? I think everyone's sort of scared of Iran. All those other countries are scared of Iran. Can you just talk about that, how that will help or not?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that first of all, I see it as an amazing thing, the fact that we do have normalization or any kind of official agreements, diplomatic agreements and relationship with those countries. Something that we had in the past, but they were informal, and those things changed. But we have to understand something. Here I talked mostly about the threat coming from Syria, which is Iran. And regarding to that, it's not a matter of trust, but I wouldn't say that Israel should think that we created kind of a Sunni crescent with the Emirates and with the Saudis and with Bahrain and others that will stand against the Shiite crescent that Iran trying to build through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It's not the same thing, which means that when I trying to understand the entrance of the Emirates to have relationship with Israel, so I would say that they concern from three main things. The first thing is the access of the Shiites. Means no doubt that the Emirates feel completely exposed to the Iranians. They're very close. They're on the other side of the Persian Gulf. It's a hostility that started 1400 years ago between the Sunnis and the Shiites, between the Arabs and the Persians, something that has a lot of history. This is one thing. There's another thing that they concern, I won't say even less, which is what they call the Akhwani, the Muslims Brotherhood, the brothers, which is kind of an axis built by Qatar and Hamas and Turkey. And again, here, Turkey that trying to lead the Muslims Brotherhood, and all kind of different provocations against the Arabs, that's something that concerned them very much. And this is another common enemy with Israel. Something that, by the way, might change regarding to Israel. We saw Duan that now talking about normalization with Israel. Something that we had till 2018, yeah? It's not something new with Turkey. The other thing that they're concerned about is the radical Sunnah, which is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the others, the Salafiyya Jihadiyya, the global jihad. This is another common enemy. And here the Emirates came and say, okay, we have an opportunity here to get closer to Israel and to other moderate countries in the Middle East that just want to live their life peacefully. And therefore, we're starting to get close. But when we saw a situation, for example, the oil tankers that attacked last year, what the Emirates done against it? Nothing. When we saw in September last year, the Iranians attacking by cruise missiles and drones, oil fields and refineries in Saudi Arabia and Khoris and Abqaiq, and destroyed the export of oil for about a week, and for a month they could export 50%. We saw any response coming from Saudi Arabia. And here the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in Iran. Means what was the response of the Emirates? They condemned Israel. They came against it. They had parties in Abu Dhabi, but in the same time, officially, they came and said, we're condemning Israel. That wasn't the right thing to do. Which means that that's the culture over there. On one hand, they will say we are the best friends of Israel. On the other hand, I don't think that Israel could trust those guys in a way that we're gonna take off from the airports of Abu Dhabi with our F-35 if there's gonna be any attack on Iran. And I would say another thing. Here regarding to different rebels groups that we have along the border that asking for support from the Emirates. What the Emirates came and said to them, no problem. We'll send the weapons through Israel. Israel will decide whether to give you those weapons or not. This is something very convenient for the Emirates. Why? Because then they paying for the weapon, but we are the one that getting involved in the Syrian war. So, or another example, one of the diplomats from Abu Dhabi came and said, Israel should destroy Hezbollah. Of course, we need to destroy Hezbollah. We're going to pay by our blood of our soldiers for destroying Hezbollah, which is also a common enemy of the Emirates, of the Saudis. They support the Houthis in Yemen that bombing Saudi Arabia on a daily basis. So in this case, don't understand me wrong. I'm very glad that we have a relationship with them. But in terms of defense, I don't think that those relationships will make a significant change.
So we could visit those countries and spend our money there, but you can't. They're not going to support you in some kind of conflict, or they're going to hope. They're going to hope that they could pull you into it to do the dirty work.
Economically excellent, tourism, many Israelis getting there. They're getting back with COVID. That's a different story, but it's all nice and it's excellent. I hope that it will continue and more countries will join the normalization. It's something unbelievable. And the fact that now maybe preventing another conflict between us and the Turks that see they left completely isolated. Excellent, all good. And it all deters Iran and concern Iran. But eventually we have to understand and be honest with ourselves that hopefully we won't have a conflict with Iran, but if we will, we're going to be there probably by ourselves.
Thank you everybody for coming. A special thank you for Captain Ilan Shulman for staying up at this hour. As you understand it, it's past midnight right now in Israel. And I hope that he will be willing to come again on a future webinar, hopefully in the near future. And Good night, everyone. We'll be in touch about the next webinar and when it's going to be. My son is having his bar mitzvah this Friday, so we're very excited and a bit busy. So next week I'm going to skip, but probably the week after that. You are signed into my email list, and anyone who is signed will receive an automatic invitation, and I'll update as follows. Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.